Hello, hello. I'm Casey,
And I'm Fallon.
and this is
Render the Darkness. It's gonna be a new thing now.
Alright. That's our new thing, the hands. Fluttershy, my little pony. Anyway. Okay. Thank you for joining us today as we're going to be going over part 2 of Alcatraz prison.
Alright, ghosties.
Ghosties. Alright, fun fact for this episode, your brain is constantly eating itself through a process called phagocytosis in an attempt to preserve your brain matter.
That is really gross.
Well, your gray brain matter, I should have said. Sorry, gray brain matter.
That's even grosser.
Yeah.
Did not help.
I will heads up you here this episode, and I'm sure some of you will appreciate this. It's only about half as long as the part 1 episode was, but it's still filled with just as much fun to learn and hear information.
Yay.
Plus, you get to see us. It's better than that. Let's pick right up where we left off on part 1. The prison closed in 1963 and laid fairly dormant until November 20th, 1969. That is when the occupation of Alcatraz began.
Ooh.
Before we get into that, though, let's talk about the action that took place that led to this event. So let's step back in time to 1964. Let's go back to the day that I'm about to talk about. Because I had that typed completely wrong. So, sorry. I don't think I mentioned it or went far enough back in the history of the island to mention it on part 1. But before the government or the military owned the island, or before it was even discovered in 1775, it was believed to be occupied by Native Americans. The Bay Area was inhabited by the Native Americans in the 1500s. There was said to be around 10,000 indigenous people in this area.
Wow.
I think I read they were called the Olon. I think is how you say it. If I said that wrong, I'm sorry. Ohlone.
Alone.
They lived between Point Sur and the San Francisco Bay. This is going to bring us to talk about the Treaty of Laramie, also known as the Sioux Treaty of 1868. This treaty was, I'm sorry, I said Sioux, it's Sow. I apologize. This treaty was made between the U.S. and the Sow. Basically, what this treaty said was that all abandoned or any federal land that was no longer in use that the indigenous people had ever previously occupied would be returned to them.
Oh, good.
So once the prison closed and the island was no longer being used, this inspired a group of Sikangu Lakotas led by Velva Cordier and her cousin Richard Mackenzie. They were able to obtain a copy of the treaty and make their way to the island in an attempt to declare it as Indian territory.
Nice.
They wanted to use the treaty as a way to get a title to the island under the idea that the Sow or So had a right to claim it. I'm not 100. Will you Google how to say that?
Yes.
I feel like I'm saying it wrong. I should have Googled it ahead of time. Nope, you're fine. I think it's Sow, but it could be Sue.
How the hell do you turn your phone on?
There's a button on the side.
Okay.
I should have Googled that. Just another testament to our newbie beginnings and our unprofessionalism. SIOUX. What are your glasses for? Why are you squinting? The screen is right there.
Well, I had to find the word. I guess if I would look for the Hey, alright, here we go.
Sioux. Okay, so I'm sorry. The Sioux had a right to claim it. Thank you for looking that up.
You're very welcome.
This attempted takeover only lasted for 4 hours. Their claims were deemed unfounded by the Attorney General, and after this, custody of the island was given to the U.S. General Services Administration with the intention of the island potentially becoming a recreational site, which after the Department of the Interior were able to determine if they would be able to, they'd be able to use it as one. The deadline for that decision was set for December 1969.
All right.
Unfortunately, before that deadline was able to be reached, I don't want to say unfortunate, maybe not unfortunately, but before the deadline could be reached on November 20th, 1969, another group of indigenous people took inspiration from the events of 1964 when Belva Cordier and her cousin Richard Mackenzie and 3 others attempted to claim the land for the Indians, and at this point another attempt was made to take over the island. This attempt is what was known as the occupation of Alcatraz. It was led by Richard Oakes and Lenata Means. This attempt would trigger what turned into a 19-month-long protest. They wanted to use the land or the island as a cultural and educational center. They implemented the Act of Civil Disobedience to illustrate the hardships Native Americans faced. This created mass support and caused thousands of people to migrate to the island, which you'd think was a good thing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that was way too many people for the leaders of the group to control. Once they lost control, that's when the vandalism began. They covered the buildings of the island in graffiti. They set fires that destroyed several of the buildings on the island, such as the warden's mansion and the lightkeeper's home. Federal officers were able to remove all of the Native Americans and their supporters by 1972 from the island. Shortly after that, Congress included the island as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area Service Unit and was open to the public in 1973.
Okay.
Now that we've talked about the history of the island and some of the prisoners the island housed over the years, let's talk about the paranormal side of the island.
Ghosties.
Ghosts. There are several ghosts said to occupy the island. Alcatraz has an interesting myth tied to it where some people believe it's actually a portal to another dimension, which absolutely lends to why so many people believe it to be occupied by otherworldly things.
Okay, that makes sense.
Well, that's just one reason. One of the other reasons is obviously its extensive history as a place that once housed war prisoners and some of the world's worst prisoners, and just, the island did see quite a bit of death.
Yes.
in its time, and that's not even including, before it was used for prison purposes.
Right. There's a lot of stuff going on there, so.
In fact, it said that the Native Americans who occupied the area of the Point Sur and San Francisco Bay believed that the island was surrounded by evil spirits, and that was like way before the island was mapped, let alone used by any military or as a prison. That's why it said that they used the island as a form of punishment for those that broke tribal law. The person would be sentenced to the island to go live amongst the evil spirits, thereby being cursed by them.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Some of them even committed offenses high enough that they would be banished to the island for life.
Ooh.
So definitely people died there before history was even being recorded about what was going on there. Supposedly, these spirits can still be seen, heard, and felt.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of sounds, visitors and workers regularly report hearing. There are a lot of strange and haunting sounds throughout the island. They've reported things such as metal doors clanging, men screaming, whistling, voices, apparitions. They also claim that as you get closer to what was referred to as the dungeon area, the screams start to become more terrifying. There's also been reports that were made by the guards when it was still a functioning prison. Some of them claim to hear crying and moaning. They said they would often smell really pungent odors out of nowhere.
Diamond.
They also reported an entity they called the Thing roaming around the halls. It would appear with glowing eyes.
Demon.
Possibly.
I don't know if you heard me or not. Demon.
There's...
Sorry. I thought you were waiting for me to do it again. Because you had to pause. I won't do it again.
You're fine. There's been more reports of the ghost of soldiers and old prisoners appearing suddenly. Warden Johnston once reported hearing a woman sobbing while he was doing a tour of the prison. The guests that were with him said they heard her crying too, and that the sounds were coming out of the walls of the dungeon.
Ooh.
They all reported that the instant the crying stopped, they all felt an ice-cold wind fly by.
Ooh.
Speaking of Warden Johnston, one haunting or apparition was spotted at a Christmas party he was hosting at the warden's house. Some of the guards swore a man suddenly appeared before them dressed in a gray suit and a brimmed cap, and that the room suddenly became very cold and the fire that was burning in the stove went out. When that happened, the man disappeared.
Ooh.
The guards also claimed to sometimes hear gunshots, and sometimes they would hear the cannons going off. That was usually followed by such an intense scream that oftentimes they would think it had to be an inmate who had escaped and somehow attained a weapon. But that was never seemingly the case in these particular instances. After checking out the sounds, there was never anything there.
Wow.
The lighthouse has also claimed to have... the lighthouse was also claimed to have been haunted. Sorry. I think I forgot to mention this in part 1, but I read a source that said the lighthouse was torn down when the prison was built.
Oh.
But either way, the story of the haunting is that the ghost is believed to be that of its very first keeper, one Mr. James A. King, who was said to have died under very mysterious circumstances there. People have claimed to be able to hear whistling coming from it, and that there's a green light that comes from it, floats around the island, and then vanishes.
Oh wow, so maybe it's like him roaming around the island with the light, like a lantern?
Yeah. I think it's more of like a phantom beacon of the lighthouse. Like,
okay,
the light
yeah, like
would... Yeah. It's more like they see a phantom, because, the lighthouse lights turn.
Yeah.
So I think it's more like that, maybe?
Oh, cool. That would be cool to see.
Let's talk about some of the more famous ghosts that are said to still be haunting the island.
Okay.
Robert Stroud. Remember him from part 1?
Yeah.
AKA the Birdman?
Birdman. Bird.
Now, I don't really know why or how he even would be haunting the island since he didn't die there, but that doesn't stop people from claiming to see an apparition that looks just like him floating and roaming around the hospital, which, if you remember, is where he spent the bulk of his stint at the prison, so that part makes sense. Couldn't really find a whole lot about that one other than...
Well, maybe it was because they were the ones that actually gave him all the birds, so he probably really enjoyed it there.
They didn't give him birds at Alcatraz. That was at Leavenworth.
Why was I thinking they did that at Alcatraz?
No.
Never
That was at
mind.
Leavenworth. It would have been a good theory if you had been correct.
Yeah, I tried.
That's okay. The next one is definitely the most famous. This ghost is referred to as the Man of Cell 14D. This cell is said to run cold all year round. Guards and visitors have reported tons of strange occurrences coming from this cell. They regularly hear knocking on the walls and chains rattling, and some of them even claim to see a man in the cell.
Mm.
The story goes that while confined to this cell, which is one of the cells that are considered the hole,
Okay.
one night the man who was in there began screaming that there was a malevolent creature with glowing eyes trying to kill him. Does that creature sound familiar?
Yeah.
Remember the Thing? Strangely enough, according to the story, the next day he would be found dead in that very cell. Some sources say he had a heart attack, some say he was murdered, and some say he was strangled to death so hard that the handprints were still on his neck. But the mystery still remains, and apparently so does the inmate.
The demon got him.
Yeah, maybe. So which account of how he died do you believe? Was it one of the evil spirits? Was it natural causes? Or did the guards get frustrated with all of his screaming?
It was the
You decide. The next one. The next one is known as the Lady in Green. Most often being seen in the washroom of what was once an apartment located on Alcatraz Hill, this apartment was once home to one of the prison wardens who used to live there, and I could not for the life of me find which warden it was.
Okay.
Anyway, the woman is said to have brown hair and is described as middle-aged and always wearing a green dress. The ghost is thought to belong to a woman who committed suicide on the island. Some sources say that woman was the warden's wife.
Oh.
Again, I couldn't find which one or if that was even true. But apparently, one of the warden's wives supposedly killed herself while he was working.
Oh, okay.
I looked at every source I could think of, and I could not verify that at all. So, just throwing it in there in case it is accurate, but I don't know that that's accurate.
Well, I mean, if it was in one source,
Another prisoner visitors claim to still be haunting the prison walls is none other than Al Capone.
Al Capone.
People claim to hear his banjo playing and that they see white orbs regularly floating around his old cell. Leaves the same question I asked earlier about the Birdman. Why would Al Capone be haunting the prison, especially when he didn't die there? This one might actually have somewhat of an explanation. Al Capone was suffering from neurosyphilis, which causes deterioration of one's mind. In fact, he died less than 10 years after getting out of prison at only 48 years old from the disease.
Oh, dang, I didn't know that.
Yeah. The theory is that even though he left there physically, a piece of him may have remained trapped at the prison forever. Maybe it was a piece of his deteriorating mind, or, there was also some sources that said that maybe he was tormented so much psychologically that a piece of him stayed there in that sense. That's kind of some theories that float around why he might still be there.
Yeah, I didn't realize he died so young because of that. Wow.
Next is the story of the ghost of the butcher, which was the nickname given to an assassin, so the research said, by the name of Abby Maldowich. I also read somewhere that he was brought into Alcatraz to be a hitman, but was murdered instead.
Oh, well, that didn't go well, did it?
There have been countless claims of his presence. There have also been numerous paranormal investigators and psychics that have visited the island over the years. One of these psychics was a woman named Sylvia Brown. She was pretty well known at the time, and she brought along with her a CBS News crew to perform a reading.
Okay.
She claimed to have encountered a presence that she could only refer to as the Butcher. And almost every paranormal investigation that has been done there has wielded results of some sort, from sounds to voices to cold spots and orbs. There have also been a couple pictures produced that claim to have captured a ghost woman. I seen one that was behind a glass window, and another visitor took a picture of a very similar woman sitting in the driver's seat of a truck. I will post the links that will take you to the images of both of those in the show notes. I also read that there have been known to be disappearances of prisoners and guests. And no, not the prisoners who disappeared trying to escape, but that there were other prisoners who would just disappear out of nowhere, leaving nothing more than a cold spot.
Ooh.
But then they would mysteriously reappear somewhere else later, disoriented and confused.
Huh.
I don't know if that's something that's actually been reported as happening, but I read it and thought it might be important to the episode, so I included it.
Oh, that's interesting.
Before I end this episode, let's just go over a little bit of the history of some of the recorded deaths the island has seen, not including the Native Americans who were banished because there just isn't enough recorded information about that to even guess a number.
Okay.
From 1875 to 1910, 35 soldiers and prisoners of war died. 20 from disease, 1 from murder, 5 suicides, and 9 accidental deaths.
Oh, no.
Since there was only one murder, let me just tell that story real quick. The murder was actually part of a murder-suicide. One Captain William D. Dietz shot and killed his wife, then turned the gun on himself.
Oh, no.
Reading about his history, that they weren't able to diagnose things back then, such as like PTSD or anything like that.
Yeah.
But I would say he was definitely suffering from some kind of severe PTSD. If you look him up, he lived through a lot, and he's seen some things that I can't even begin to imagine how a person would cope with.
Yeah.
So, sad, but that's my personal opinion, what probably happened there. As for deaths while the prison was open, there was a recorded 8 people who were killed by inmates. We discussed several of the officers who encountered this fate, but there were other inmates who died at the hands of their fellow inmates as well.
Okay.
15 people who died of natural causes, and 5 that committed suicide. Believe it or not, there was actually 0 executions performed on the island.
Wow.
The island did have a morgue, but it did not have an execution chamber.
Oh,
So if you remember correctly, when I on part 1, when I talked about them getting the gas chamber, they got that at San Quentin, so that didn't actually happen on the island.
Okay.
Yeah. 7 inmates were shot and killed by officers while attempting to escape. 2 drowned, and 5 are on the missing and presumed dead or drowned list.
Okay.
Also, one last myth to talk about is that when people refer to the dungeons, that it's believed that these are Spanish dungeons, but that's not true.
Okay.
What they are talking about is when the military had their prisons built, they built a citadel for like the most unruly prisoners to be held in, and they were kind of like underground cells.
Okay.
So they would be chained to windows and forced to stand for extended periods of time.
Ooh.
They were in total darkness and given nothing but a bucket to relieve themselves in. The most common sentence to the citadel confinement, from what I could see, was about 2 weeks at a time. And then after a while, the prisoners themselves are who started referring to them as the Spanish dungeons.
Oh, okay.
They were torn down in 1908, but the new prison was built on top of them, placing their location just underneath cell block A.
Okay.
So when I referred to the dungeons earlier, that's the history and their location.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
I was like, dungeons? Like, I don't remember.
So technically they're not dungeons, but that's just what they were referred to.
Okay.
So that being said, what do you think? You think the island is haunted, or has any of our listeners ever had the privilege of touring the island? If so, what do you think? Any experiences or feelings or anything you could share with the group?
Any interactions with the ghosties?
Yeah.
A little touch.
That'll like the touches. That'll like the touches. But yeah, that is part 2. And I'm sure there's somebody out there, some kind of historian that knows way more about Alcatraz than I do, or that I could have found in my research. So if there is someone out there and you have more information that you would like to contribute or add, please feel free to email at renderthedarknesspod@gmail.com, or comment or hit us up on any social media messaging. We'd be happy to know more about it if there's something that I missed or left out.
Yep.
Other than that, it's still one of the most toured places on Earth.
I'd like to go there one day. I think it'd be pretty cool, but I'd like to do it at night. I wonder if they do night tours.
I'm sure. I don't know. Because you have to get on a ferry to get over there, so. Yeah, I don't know.
They'd probably make a lot more money if they did night tours. I'll have to look at it.
I mean, I read that there's still to this day 1 million people a year go tour that island.
We should do it.
I am 100% on board to tour it, as long as we can drive to get there. Not a big plane person.
I'll only get on a plane maybe once, maybe twice in my life, and that is going to be it. That's going to be to go to the Ireland or the Australia. And that's it.
There you go. All right. Well, as always, thank you for joining us. I hope you found the information about Alcatraz as informative and interesting as I did.
That was pretty cool. I liked it.
Yeah.
I learned a lot. The Birdman and the Demon.
It's not a thing. Just making that up.
What, the Demon?
Yeah.
The glowy eyes?
The thing?
Yeah, the Demon. I'm calling it the Demon.
You decide.
The Demon.
All right. Thank you guys so much. We are Render the Darkness.